Perfect. Welcome, guys. Today we got a super interesting class, or at least interesting for myself, because I really love this topic, which is super interesting and full of history and that speak itself about terroir and ingredients and time and people. It's super beautiful. Wild fermentation that these days it seems something cool and new age and something that we are discovering now, since also the information that you can find around are really subjective and from personal experience of each one that is telling the stories. I mean, it seems something new age, but it's super ancestral and before 1800s, where Louis Pasteur discovered under the microscope that the fermentation was a biological process that involves yeast. Before that, if you think so, everything was wild fermented. So even what was before wine and beer was way different than what we are actually experiencing right now. In this last 20 years of history, we lived super standardizations and with different also stupid laws, and we've been drinking cheap pasteurized and shitty lagers. And now beers, if you think about beers, you just think about a lager, pretty tasteless, but it was way different before, because since everything was wild fermented, was way more interesting and way more diverse by product to product. Also wines, as the Romans used to drink, it was completely different than Saccharomyces cerevisiae, sulfites, French oak, and all the red wines, they taste the same. A punch in your face of alcohol and oak, and they're all sadly the same. With wild fermentation, wild fermentation is basically leave the wild bacteria and yeast already present on the beautiful fruits, grains, or the sugary mediums you would like to ferment, and leave it do their job. It follows the same principles of the fermentation we already know, alcoholic fermentation and lactic fermentation with Saccharomyces or Lactobacillus, because of course we can commercially buy a diverse range of yeast and bacteria, but we can also find it in wild form. So those are the main yeasts and bacteria that we can commercially buy, or generally the ones found in ferments. For yeasts, we got Saccharomyces cerevisiae, which is the main yeast responsible for alcoholic fermentation and converting sugars into alcohol, carbon dioxide, and of course aromatic compounds like esters and phenols that we already know. So today we won't discuss on Saccharomyces, but we'll analyze more in depth the other topics. So just a brief about today's class. Sorry. We'll see first the different yeast and bacteria. Later on, we'll see how to find them in nature and how to forage ingredients that contains naturally those yeast and bacteria. We'll then understand how to cultivate those yeast and create a wild yeast starters that we can actually use to inoculate all the fermented beverage we'll see we got into the academy. And as a last part, I left some examples, beautiful examples of wild fermented products, and we'll discuss a little bit on that. Later on, if you got questions, please write it down, and at the end of the class, we're going to reply on that. So today we won't see much Saccharomyces, but we got another super interesting yeast, which is Brettanomyces family, that has all those yeast as species and subspecies and different strains if they are selected by men, so that things get complicated. But let's go easy. And we got also, in this case, Lactobacillus, Pediococcus, and Acetobacter. Brettanomyces is by far, in my opinion, one of the most interesting yeast and wild yeast also around, because it's one of those yeast that you rather love it or hate it, because it's pretty intense and pretty characteristic. So if you like these nuance of flavors that develop, otherwise probably you'll try to avoid it because it's pretty particular. It is an yeast, not a bacteria, as many things. It is widely used in sour beers or wild fermented or co-fermented products, and usually in the species of Brettanomyces, Anomalous, and Bruxellensis. The good things of Brettanomyces, talking about the sour beer production, is that ferment dextrins, which are complex and longer chains of sugars that Saccharomyces cerevisiae cannot convert. So Brettanomyces can do some jobs that Saccharomyces can't. And in this case, fermenting dextrins, and while they convert dextrins, they create a wide range of aromatic compounds like esters and phenols, some of them lovely and beautiful, like super fruity and tropicals aroma, which has esters, lovely ones like pineapples, apples, and pear, super fruity and aromatic, pretty intense and delicious, to be honest. And some other compounds that in really small quantities, they add a lot of complexity, and they are not that detectable. Of course, if you got a little percentage inside of a bouquet of big aroma, it just adds different layers of complexity. Of course, if this level goes a little bit up, it can be disturbing for some people, because there are some other less appreciated aromas that they call it like horse blankets. To me, it smells and in some way tastes like beast, like a goat. I mean, the fur of a goat is something really wild, or barnyard, acrid smoke, or even vomits. This is to exaggerate, and to not exaggerate, but to go on the flavors in a like a sommelier kind of detecting the types of flavors. Of course, your fermented won't taste like vomits in 99% of the situation, but a touch of barnyard, of this resinous solvent-like aroma in a tiny percentage, mixed with a nice pineapples and hope and acidity, it creates a beautiful bouquet and complexity in aromas. So it's truly beautiful in my personal opinion. It is an yeast, as we said, so it consumes sugar and produce a part of these aromatic components, of course, alcohol and carbon dioxide. And it's slower in a way compared to Saccharomyces cerevisiae that goes straight to convert sugars in alcohol. Brettanomyces, it takes more time. So usually fermentation are longer, and in order to convert also the job that Saccharomyces couldn't do, dextrins and other molecules, it will require more months, and generally 6 months on fermentation with Brettanomyces develops all these particular Brettanomyces aromas. Does not contribute to the acidity, so it's not used to low down pH or create the sourness in sour beers, and it does produce alcohol, as we thought. In the only exception where it's lived in contact with air, with a lot of oxygen, and it can produce acetic acid. But the beautiful and most magical and not well understood part of Brettanomyces is, well, is right, the esters and these aromatic compounds developments, because esters are produced from fatty acids, alcohol that integrate and react with them, and Brettanomyces that develops unique esters and aromas. So Also, while your fermentation produce alcohol, the alcohol level that increase, it will react with the blend of acidity and other proteins and stuff and destrings and other sugars that are not converted into your ferment. So it's pretty alive. It will convert over time and is a longer fermentation. And sometimes, well, we'll see later with the lambic beers. We got Lactobacillus. Lactobacillus is a bacteria and is a pretty simple, let's say, and straightforward fermentation, because Lactobacillus convert the sugars into lactic acid. It will not produce generally alcohol, but and not notable aromatic components, but pretty straightforward converting sugars into lactic acid. It works really nice and live really nice, like the Saccharomyces range of temperature. Of course, in higher temperature, it will go really, really fast. So it will convert a lot of sugar and a lot of acid really quickly. And under the 13 degrees will go dormant, similar almost to the Saccharomyces. Usually is alcohol intolerant, but of course, man selected this specific type that can, of course, live in higher percentages of alcohol. Here I wrote a little example. Kettle sour is a beautiful technique that some kind of sour beer is a way of producing a specific type of sour beer, which is the Berlin Weiss, which is a low ABV, 3% alcohol sour beer from Germany based on wheat and malt, of course. And they do what is called kettle sour. During the production of beers, you'll heat up some water with grains, you infuse the grains, you make a juice of grains, you separate the grains, and then you boil it with some hop, cool it down, and add the yeast in an easy way. What they do is preparing in the pot. This is the kettle where you cook. We warm up the water, add the grains, and then strain the grains. And before the boiling, they don't boil at the moment. They will add in this sugary must, which is sugars, maltose, sucrose, and etc. from the grains, from the malted grains. They will add the Lactobacillus cultures. They will close down and leave it to ferment at room temperature, the same temperature we saw, for a few days until the Lactobacillus colonized, of course, in the first day and start to produce lactic acid, and that will low down the pH. So they will stop the fermentation when it reaches the exact pH that they want, usually 3.5 for a sour beer of that style. And when it's fermenting 3-4 days and it has the right pH, it looks like that. Because after 4 days, all this mass fermentation, how they stop it? They turn on the heat, they will boil the must, because during the preparation, they need to boil it, because then they'll add hops. So boiling that, they will kill down all the lactobacillus. So in the boiled and cooled must, then you don't have lactobacillus, and they'll add Saccharomyces to ferment alcoholically and convert sugar into alcohol. So they'll use just lactobacillus to inoculate them, to convert a little bit of sugar into lactic acid, to low down the pH, then boil it, kill the lactobacillus, and start a fermentation with Saccharomyces cerevisiae. So now it's called kettle sour. Is the quickest and easiest way to produce sour beer. In few days, you low down the pH and then you ferment it alcoholically. Usually traditional sour beers are way more complex. Another bacteria is the Pediococcus, that is straightforward as the Lactobacillus consume sugars into lactic acid. They say that it is a little bit more aggressive in acidity, like a little bit more pungent, but it's another bacteria used to low down pH or create acidity, because this is what it does. And of course, another important bacteria, talking about beverages or fermented beverages, are Acetobacter. Acetobacters are bacteria that are found everywhere in the air around you. And if you simply expose a ferment that has already developed some alcohol to oxygen, you will expose it to Acetobacter. And what Acetobacter does is converts alcohol. So there's need to be alcohol already in your ferments, and it consume alcohol into, they will consume alcohol into acetic acid. So your alcohol percentage will low down, and you will have acetic acid, which is vinegar. Of course, talking about wines, this is considered an off flavor, so something that you should avoid as much as you can. And of course, this is how they do. But in beer production, in some sour and wild beer, a tiny bit of vinegary taste, a tiny bit, it will, of course, make taste more complex. It has a different layers of acidity. So Acetobacter, of course, is important to know because it's always present, and you need to be sure you don't expose your ferment, your alcoholic ferment already, to oxygen. Otherwise, there's the possibility, of course, to Acetobacter to thrive and to almost destroy your ferment, because they will convert the alcohol and you don't have any more alcohol, and you got vinegar instead.